Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, yes, they did. They absolutely got it right. So delighted to have you back with me. And for those that aren't watching on the video but are listening on the radio, I have my good friend Adam Retych here with me today. Again, it's been what, since October or so since you were here?
Yeah,
Last? Yeah.
several months. Yeah,
Yeah, delighted to have you back.
good to be back. Thank
Yeah,
you.
good. We're excited. We're going to pick up with some of the what Adam was talking about when he was here last, but I want to try to kind of give you the rundown of what we're going to do today. So the first and third segment, we're going to talk about the social emotional learning. We're going to talk a little bit about the Ohio Strategic Plan for Education, which that is a component of. And then what we're going to do in the second segment is we're going to have kind of an interesting conversation about this whole thing about the Electoral College, and that now there is actually a referendum for the Ohio, coming up for an election to change our constitution to do what I call is the winner take all when it comes to a presidential race. So I think it's really a shift. So I think we're going to have some fun with that, and we'll bring some information to everybody out there and get Adam's perspective, and we'll talk about some of the fun stuff. But one thing that I wanted to bring up is that I got thinking about it when I thought about Sam Adams, and I thought about one of the key issues that was happening in the day. And there's a little bit of surprise for you on this one, Adam.
Oh boy.
Yeah, but it's not. It's easy because you don't even have to worry about it on a discussion point unless you want to jump in. But
okay. So long as there'll be no test.
No test.
Okay.
Not
good.
today. You had enough of that. And one of the things that I was thinking about with Sam Adams and what was happening that brought the revolutionary period into existence, and one of the things as the last Puritan that was important to him was that we maintained that Reformation perspective, that we maintained that whole view of that purity within the context of religion. And that was Sam Adams being the last Puritan. I mean, he was a strong, that's what his mom raised him, was underneath all of those Reformation principles. He was a strong Congregationalist from that true Congregationalists, not what the Congregationalists are today, but what they were as they came from that Puritan heritage. And Sam Adams was always looking at what was happening in culture. He knew not only what was happening in politics, but what was happening in religion and culture. And so that's why in a number of his writings, he discussed the idea of bishopry, what was happening even not just from the Romanist or the Roman Catholic perspective, but he also was talking about what was happening from the Anglican perspective and how that was being imposed upon New England in particular, because the Anglican religion, if you will, was predominant in the southern states, but that was changing. Presbyterianism went in, and so on and so forth. That really exploded in the southern states. But what he was very, very frustrated was that as much as the Parliament was taking and imposing all of these other taxation rules and regulations, they were starting to impose bringing bishops in, which was contrary to what happened from the independent side of Puritanism as well as in Congregationalism. So they're really trying to push in that Anglican state religion. And he's sitting there going, no, that's one of the things that was becoming intolerable. So what got me this morning, I was reading this article that a representative, J-Pal, which is, let's see, Pramila J-Pal, a Democratic representative, is coming in here and saying that the federal government must regulate behavior of the 330 million Americans to protect the freedom of transgender people, says a progressive Democrat representative Pramila J-Pal. And I was going through a number of other articles in that, and I'm just sitting here going, wait a minute, that's a total imposition on our religious liberties. So as we make a transition here, and the tie-in for me on this was something you brought up, the last time we were together, and you are going to bring up to an extent in your closure, I know that you did the last time. What in the world is going on with social emotional learning? Because to me, that's again pushing social emotional stuff that impacts the freedom of thought and to some extent freedom of religion. So why don't you take and just give us an update? What's happening in Ohio around social emotional learning? Where did we leave off the last time? And then we'll get into some of the new stuff.
Well, sure. And, just to provide some context, social emotional learning, according to CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, they're the promoters of this SEL or SEL. Their definition is that social and emotional learning is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitude, and skills necessary to understand and manage their emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make good, responsible decisions. So that being said, it's easy to see how this pernicious, very pervasive mindset can fool many people. And so basically, CASEL has set this SEL curriculum up for the states to adopt. And so currently in Ohio, these SEL standards, which are proposed in their strategic 2019 through 2024 plan, you can find this online, the strategic plan for Ohio, details some major reforms to education. And
that one sets me off. Every time I go through and read it, the folks, Adam, that you're not seeing it on YouTube, Adam held that up, but you can find it online.
And so there are essentially 4 learning outcomes that are basically the quintessential pillars holding this whole curriculum up. Ultimately, school is more than just school with these. So now the first of which is the foundational knowledge and skills learning. So this is probably perhaps the most conventional aspect. It's designed to be used to equip each child with a critical reading, writing, and numerical, as well as technical skill understanding, basically designed to cause a lifelong love of learning, at least they say. However, it's interesting to note that with this first pillar, they're concerned with the long-term goal, right? They're concerned with the lifelong learning of the child, which is perhaps an emphasis not normally taken. And perhaps we can kind of touch on that.
I think we will, but one of the things that, just to go with that, is that as I looked at that, just the terminology that they're using, instead of mathematics or looking at those that as a science or as a real skill, they're using that term numerical. It's like, what does that mean? Common Core, you got all sorts of numbers splattered all over. Anyway,
it's general.
I want to go down that path.
As a physicist yourself, you pick up on those subtleties. And so the second pillar, which is a well-rounded content emphasis, and they say on their, at least in this strategic plan, that students need exposure to a broader range of subjects and disciplines, and this includes the science, world languages, arts, health, physical education, and career and technical fields. Now, this looks pretty conventional, Tom. However, the well-rounded content, well, tell me what you think.
What is it? I can't figure that out. When you start bringing that in, what I started looking at is that they don't come together well, first off, because they're all segregated as far as when I look at science, what are those disciplines within science alone? And then, what is world languages? You're starting to draw in everything else. Where is it in relationship to what's happening? There's nothing here that I saw on American history, or am I missing something?
Well, one thing that I pick up is that they're concerned with the end product. Mm-hmm. And of course, I've heard school, referred to as an economy. There's an economy of the school itself, with grades, being just the emphasis and the incentive. as well as the end product of where these students will go and what they'll be doing. However, this is revolutionary. So, there's little free choice of the student here. But let me just get to the last two tiers, which I think are perhaps the more radical.
Exactly.
And so this is leadership and reasoning skills. Mm-hmm. And just to remind the audience that these four pillars, to quote the strategic plan, are viewed as equal. So, so basically the leadership and reasoning skills, quoting the articles, leadership includes learning from mistakes and basically improving for the future, listening to others and working to achieve a common goal, and giving and receiving feedback. Reasoning, what they mean by reasoning, is being multidisciplined in order to synthesize information and develop creative solutions, and to think computationally. And I'm using the exact words that they use. And let me just hit the last one, social and emotional learning, which we talked about last time. And this is essentially, the self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, that we had already touched on, and we had already touched on some of the implications of that. But one thing that I just noticed is that these four pillars are equal. And so that these emotional needs will be definitely prioritized, above the American government and, historical accounts and so on, but will be also on par in treated with or emphasized as much as science and other more core studies.
So one of the things I want to follow, because we're down to the last few minutes here, and I'll give you a wrap up here in a minute, is that what I'd like to follow up in the third segment with in relationship to all of this is the data collection components that are brought out inside of the strategic plan. Because each one of these is, when I started looking at the metric design and I started looking at how they were going to collect data, and we know that already students are given Chromebooks, and here it is. So they're collecting all of the data. And what parents don't understand with that is that based on how both Microsoft and Google are operating within that context, every keystroke, everything that a child goes to on that Chromebook is being collected in that database. So all of the emphasis that you were bringing out in relationship to looking forward, this goes back to the conversations I had on how are they then tracking and manipulating an individual, or tailoring, because that's what it talks about in a strategic plan, is a tailored education on a per child basis.
Right.
So I think we're going to have some fun with that, when we get into the third segment. So what are your quick thoughts here? Because I think we're down to the last minute. Give me 1 minute, because then I got to
absolutely.
Close
it out. And just to restate that it's a workforce that they're planning on raising up. They say an individual child emphasis, but this is really focusing on the 1.7 million students aged pre-K through 12th grade that they're planning on raising and equipping to not only fulfill the workplace and the demands in the workplace, but also to contribute. And I don't know what they mean by contribute. You can look this up for yourselves, and I would strongly encourage this, as your state might be adopting this in these procedures. So it's kind of scary, and the devil's in the details, and here we just don't have the details.
Yeah, correct. So some of the things that I've been looking at and how it fits into the strategic plan, and I think that every person needs to look out for in their own state, as well as what's happening in the state of Ohio, is that what we'll talk about is follow the money. And because there's a couple other items that we're going to catch in the third segment on this, and where does that they say in this one portion here, that not one size fits all. Well, this is what they're really trying to jam in together. Education, according to our founders, is supposed to have been started within the families, and there's a lot of issues around that from a statistical perspective that we may be able to touch upon, but I don't know if we'll get to that. So much to cover. But at least you need to know that Sam Adams understood it, because he worked with students after he retired from his political career. So what we're going to do is come back in the next segment to talk about the Electoral College, and yes, those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists absolutely got it right. This is Tom Navolis, your host, with my guest, Adam Retych. And as I always do in this segment is definitely those that are listening on Liberty Works Radio Network. I would highly encourage you to take and look through everything that's there and available on the network, the live programming, and definitely find that button. You know, it's not hard to find. It's not a secret. It's called Donate. This is a listener-funded network, and we would be delighted, I would be delighted if you took the time to investigate that and click on it. So one of the things that I mentioned in the first segment that we would talk about now in this segment is Electoral College. We are seeing, and it has been going on for at least 10 years, as I recall it, to go to this popular vote. When we were living in Washington State was one of the early adopters of the winner-take-all. So that was very, very frustrating because it takes the process away. And people don't understand what the process is, obviously because they don't understand the Constitution. And I know that there was really a good, two different good works that are out there. Is that Prager University has a nice 5-minute clip out there on the Electoral College that I highly encourage everyone to take a look at. And then Hillsdale just came out, a week or two ago, I think it was, something like that. They have their short course, about an hour long? Half hour?
About a half an hour.
Half hour long is their course on the Electoral College. So as I was talking to Adam about this at the beginning, it was like, okay, here we have in Ohio now that it was just submitted to the Secretary of State for a ballot measure to take and change the state constitution, winner take all. What do you think, Adam? What's your initial thought process? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so winner take all in political terms is referred to as a plurality, right? And so, which in a direct democracy can be a problem. And in terms of a direct democracy, specifically, I'm talking about the people, particularly the larger faction, dictating the trajectory of a nation or another faction, right? Also, there is a more controversial aspect to the Electoral College, the plurality aspect, where it's a winner-take-all system, right? So the question is it better to go with the representative Republican alternative? And when I mean Republican, I mean the Republican form of government, or the Democratic alternative. So it definitely is a controversial issue, and both have merit, but we do need to look at it through the founders' eyes and see what their thoughts and exactly why they set up that fence. And only then can we really consider if it's wise to tear it down. So we'll see from this.
You very well said.
Yeah,
now,
from this discussion, we'll see.
Where did you quote that here? Let's see. I think that was Chesterton. Didn't you just? I love that. I was going to bring that back.
Go ahead, read it.
Next segment, but you've got that one nailed.
I was alluding to it.
Yes, you were. All right. So, what does it say? Don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason why it was put up. Excellent. Yeah, you like Chesterton, don't you?
I do. He's very quotable.
He is.
Very quotable.
Yeah. But that'll have to be a whole nother topic because Chesterton, many people, especially in the general evangelical domain, they just flush him off to the side. But those that are thinkers will go back and reference him because he has just so many great things to say.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm
anyway,
off point, right?
But but that's the exact key point. The arguments that happened during the convention was that whole question of elections anyway. How do we elect legislators? How do we elect the Senate? And then what are we going to determine as that form of leadership? Are we going to have uh, a a king? Are we going to have an elected type of king, if you will? So I mean, those are the core discussions, and even from that perspective of those that were looking at the consolidated government right from the beginning. You know, you can look at Hamilton, you can look at even Madison to some extent, and Wilson for sure. You know, they were looking at that consolidated government and obviating the states in so many different ways. But what prevailed was that we are republics. And I think that's the core element that people don't get educated in today. Every state, because that was guaranteed, and it's guaranteed in the Constitution that every state would be an independent republic,
Hmm.
and then we would federate together. So
Right.
if we're doing that, how do we look at then the terms of independent republics trying to take and find a leader over that federation if every republic worked in that independent democratic republic environment to start with and representative. So we're a representative democracy even within the context of our states. So does that add to the confusion for a lot of folks?
I think it does, and perhaps to put it in simple terms, so about how we deal with power in terms of if we centralize it, because the power is there,
Mm-hmm.
or if we centralize it, or if we decentralize it, and which system is more effective and more representative of the people's will, but also the state's will,
Mm-hmm.
because we have to understand that the context of the issue is whether the president should be selected through a popular vote or through the Congress. However, there's a danger with, and I forget who said it, um, but there's a danger of the president becoming a creature of the Congress and really being an extension of the legislative branch. And of course, we know the founders' perspectives on
Mm-hmm.
the Trinitarian, the three branches of government, and the importance of having distinct, independent, co-equal branches of government.
Absolutely.
So, there's ramifications to each one of these, and perhaps you can bring up some of the original intentions
Well, yeah.
of this
In
decentralization of power.
In fact, I had to go, pull out the reference book here, and I'll hold it up for those that are watching. As you know, it's a 5-volume set on the Founders' Constitution, and I was taking a look through the constitutional debates, and there's quite a few pages in here just alone on what we have in those references. And I believe, as Adam was saying, and I haven't found the exact quote myself, but I think it was Mr. Jerry from Massachusetts that was talking about that becoming that creature of Congress. But there was significant arguments in here to take and go through and discuss this whole idea of are we having a national legislature that would be a constant intrigue kept up for the appointment, and that the legislature and the candidate uh, for president then would play into one another's hands. And that was Mr. Jerry who was bringing that out. I found
Mm.
that reference, and he gets to that that quote that you talk about. So it became that whole question in this discussion as to what type of government we were going to have in the first place. Was it going to be a consolidated government where the states would become obviated, as we were talking about earlier, or would we maintain those individual republics and we would establish that methodology upon which then the that person in that presidency would be able to be elected through a process of those individual republics. And that's where the people, that's the democratic portion of it, would elect electors. And those electors then would come together to decide who would be president. And remember, here's a critical thing that people have no idea about. At the foundation, when the Constitution was written, we didn't have a two-party system. What do you think about that? There were many people, and nobody campaigned.
Yeah, that's right.
There was no campaigning. It was selections of the most prominent people that were known within the context of morality, virtue, and good service that were brought to the slates of the various states to then go through that process and be voted on within the context of their state, and then moving that up into that larger context of what the Electoral College would do when they would come together. An interesting process. Two-party system has changed that whole environment.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, and you bring up another aspect: polarization, state polarization, and the founders, whether they knew it or not, and I have a feeling that they knew it, and definitely James Madison, the father of the Constitution, knew the power and oftentimes the preeminence of factions and the factious nature of democracy, a pure democracy. I'm sorry, which is an inclination that is often based in the passions of the people. So, the minority tyranny that is possible with small states as well as large states. So this is why this equity among the states, each state having a say, a small state having as much say as a large state, is so important, and which can only be found in a representative form of government. This is, why, that, with just typically in the Electoral College system, there is more congruity with the popular vote as well as the electoral vote. And so population is pretty representative in and of itself, but the Electoral College considers, does each state have a say, and it guarantees that, opposed to a democracy where it, depending on the factious nature of the pure democracy, might not necessarily guarantee that state having an outcome on the election.
So the interesting thing on the winner take all, and as we come to a close of this segment, is that when people start thinking about it, part of it is that, well, if that state's popular vote takes and then all of the electoral votes go based on what that popular vote is, what's the difference if it's a two-party system and you start looking at it from a popular vote? Because if the population in the state says anyway that, oh, this is the number of electoral votes that are available, well, wasn't that the populist vote that decided it in the first place? I think that's where we need to explore more, because there still is, in the states that maintain the Electoral College, a split between the parties, if you will. So the split, say Ohio has X, say they have, I think what they have a total of like 20 some, 25, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but they have, say, 20 some electoral votes. Some go to the Democrats and some go to the Republicans based on how many electors are pulled then from those numbers of the popular vote. It's kind of a goofy way of doing it, but it's not, to some extent, it follows the original intent, the original way of doing it. So I think that's where we have a lot more homework to do, and I don't think we're going to solve this in this short conversation, because there's so much from a founder's perspective, and then trying to distinguish what's actually working and what's not based on a two-party system. I think that's what's put us in a real conundrum, is the two-party system, and to what you're saying, from what's happening from that populist idea out there, and polarization and so on and so forth. So we have a lot more, folks, but just as a thought basis is that Ohio has this coming up. It's there. You can find it online. It's in the references for you to go take a look at on what that referendum is that'll be coming to the ballot. Our founders argued about it extensively to try and find that equitable way of determining how we would elect a president, because power can corrupt. And are we supposed to be a consolidated government, or are we made up of many republics? So come on back in the next segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists got it right to pick up again on SEL. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists got it right with Tom Navolis, your host, and Adam Retych, my guest. And one of the things that folks probably last week on YouTube, I somehow or another I got segment 2 and 3 flipped in the video. I know the audio and the podcast and everything was just fine, but in the video, somehow or another, I got backwards along the route. But this is segment 3, and I'll make sure that it's correct as it goes into YouTube video. But at the break, Adam and I continued that conversation about the Electoral College, and you brought up some interesting perspective. So why don't you go ahead and just bring that out a little bit? We'll talk about that a little bit, and if we have time, we'll jump back into some of the things I wanted to ask about SEL.
Sure, and this is a common perspective. That and let me just frame it to you as a question. So now, how is it that these founding fathers could expect such uneducated, such unprivileged commitment from their citizens to have a say in the presidential election? After all, didn't the founders expect them to be uneducated and unprivileged? And what I mean by privileged, I mean persons under the age 21 who were not white.
So that's a fun one, because I think that is an absolute miscalculation and misunderstanding of the founding era. So when we look at the whole revolutionary period, based on what was happening in education and what home education had to do as much as local education, the literacy rate during the founding era has been proven to be 90%. 90% of the people could read. And within that, they also had, especially in New England, they had this thing called the folkmote. And that was all part of the whole elective process or the community process. A lot of times it happened at church. Remember, churches were the places where people gathered most often, sometimes at the tavern. They didn't have a post office. They didn't have a coffee shop to go to. So you spent your whole day almost at church, and you discussed everything, and you had it within that whole context and framework. But it's fact that it was about a 90% literacy rate, to the extent that even in the House of Parliament, this was something that General Gage was very upset about when he sent a letter in and was read on the floor of Parliament, saying that the people, the general people, were smatterers in law. So that meant that the general population had a great knowledge of English law as they understood it. In fact, what it was is that there were more copies of Blackstone and what he had from his commentaries on English law were actually printed in America, that were on the shelves of homes as much as the Bible. They were almost right next to one another, and Blackstone was a pretty heavy volume of writing and information. So people now are more ignorant, in my opinion, with what we have with social media and the mainstream media and all of that, in referencing and understanding what it means to govern, to self-govern, first off, and then how general government functions and operates. People at the time knew what was going on. And so when they were framing this, and when they were framing the ideas of how to elect, it became really that discussion that we had the last time. Is it a democracy? What form of government are we going to have? Are we going to have a representative form of government? Are we going to have a pure democracy? Again, remembering that during that period of time, a lot of people understood it, maybe not in detail, but they understood the framework of ancient history. It's kind of interesting and generalized. So I think that made it. Obviously, those that ended up going to higher education knew more because they could ultimately read Greek and Latin, but that didn't mean that the framework was not disseminated, especially from the ideas of uh, common law and some of those other concepts that were brought across. And I guess when I look at it and I study the sermons during the founding era that go back to all of the what was happening from the Reformation and that whole understanding of that biblical perspective, is that the Bible lays out how governance should work. It's kind of it's right there in the Old Testament, pretty simplistically, and I think people had a grasp of what it should look like.
I see. And so, as it pertains to the electoral college system, it wasn't so much that the founders had little faith in the influence of the public themselves, so much that they had to establish electors to make the decisions for them, which is a narrative that I've heard in my government class. But the fact that it promotes representative government,
Yes.
established and articulated in the Constitution.
Right. Well, I think that that goes back to what we were talking about in the second segment, is that it comes into that what type of government we're going to have. Is it going to be a consolidated government, where the president is elected in a pure democracy format on that very 100% populist perspective, which we now learn and we can see, especially with the distribution of points of view in a two-party system, and the ideologies have shifted over the years. Even at that time, you mentioned in the last segment and even in the first segment, especially the anti-federalists, as I always say, is they understood humanity. Madison understood it. You quoted something of Madison, is that the corruption and humanity itself, I just simply say it's sinful. So from that perspective, we're going to mess up. Or you're going to have factions, or you're going to have people that, as we see in the political parties now, is that they have all of these other corrupt ideas that will impact so many others. If we didn't have a process where, in our case now, the coast would dominate with their liberal points of view, if we didn't have the Electoral College because of the population base.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that our inclination is to have direct democracy. And so that is part of where the genius of the Founding Fathers came into play. And Madison, in particular, who I quoted, how I summarize, and especially in his Federalist 10, is the mediation of the majority, right, and the magnification of the minority,
Yes.
to the point where there is equity between them and
Yes,
where they can be
exactly.
represented.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Good. So just to close out on the Electoral College, because where are we at? We're down to 7 minutes. Oh boy, how fun. Just to close that out real quick, how are your peers, or is there even any conversation within your peer group relative to the Electoral College at this time? Or is that something that's just kind of not even out there yet?
Yeah, well, so for the ones who actually know what the Electoral College is and aren't confusing it with the name of a college or thinking of it as an actual place, they believe that it was an institution established to as a substitute for the influence of the constituents of each state who were not privileged enough and not educated enough to decide for themselves so as to be governed.
Wow. We have a lot to do, don't we?
We do.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a great job.
But see,
I'm sure your
but that's where the
are
narratives,
interesting and intriguing. So very interesting.
But see, that's the narrative that is spread and disseminated in the college sphere, just because they don't know the founders' intentions.
Yes.
They don't know the belief system, and there's no why do you believe what you believe, and then have you considered the implications of that? So.
Wow. So that wraps us back, which I did want to finish out this segment with on some more on SEL.
Yep.
Yeah, so get back to that, and I hope that was helpful for all of you. And here in the next 5 minutes, there's just a couple things I wanted to get to. Is Adam, in the portion there where it talks about values, use a partnership-based approach. Uh, wow, I started going through what you sent me there. What does that mean? A partnership-based approach.
Yeah, actually, let me find that.
That was on the second to last page.
The second to last page.
Here, I'll give you my notes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So,
yeah. So now what in just to quote the strategic plan, it reads the implementation is stronger when carried out collaboratively by stakeholders, which I think is a key word here.
yes.
Going forward, this department, being the Department of Education of Ohio, will continue to convene partners, including parents, caregivers, students, educators, higher education representatives, business and philanthropy leaders, state legislators, and others to collectively, and I notice you underline that too, develop action plans aimed at implementing the plan components. So the implementation plan will be to collaborate with stakeholders, which is an important word, those who have stake, right? Those who have an asset, right? In order to implement this plan. So I don't know if you picked up on this so much, but this is going toward an agenda. This is an investment by the legislators, by teachers, by officials who normally would not have so much interest in the education system on a local level, to promote something, a long-term effect, and a long-term basically means to an end, and it's interesting that their choice of word, stakeholders. So are kids assets or are they something more?
So that brings it, to the other one that was here, and we got the 3-minute mark. They're kind of tied together for me. The one is use data to inform improvement. And as we brought up and we discussed in the first segment, there's so much going on with Chromebooks and data collection that it just blows me away that parents are not being more aware, especially what we're seeing going on with the Googles, Boogles, and all of the others, in taking and sucking up all of our information, commercializing it. And in this case, when you're looking at performance evaluation on a per child basis, I believe where it gets to is that directive that you talked about earlier, that where are they going to point somebody? This goes back to our first program back in October, where it looks pretty much like a Soviet system. And then I always have to ask that follow the money. Who's the ones that are involved in that? So go ahead and wrap up here in you got a minute and a quarter, Adam. What your thoughts
right.
are on these whole
right, and what you initially were referring to with the data. I'll just quickly wrote what was in what is in the strategic plan. Quote: the department, being the Department of Education of Ohio, will establish intermediate progress indicators that gauge the extent to which the education system and students are on track to meeting the goal. End quote. The goal. And so if I can just remind the audience of the goal is it's this 4 learning domains, which is basically the skills and then the content, but also the leadership, which we talked on. Basically the reasoning skills associated with that, as well as the social learning, like social and emotional learning, and how those 4 factors are put on the same level. And then that being the goal, and then the state coming in and evaluating the local performance on how well the teachers are evaluating the psychology and evaluating the implementation of these emotional state standards in the curriculum of the school, which it's just interesting. So I'm going to let you close, but
well, I think
yeah, that was the plan.
The important part is, and people need to go back and reference the last time, is that They want everybody to be emotionally the same. So, you know, you can be a puppet, you can be whatever it is, but what God created you to be was to be an individual and understand what that means. And that's primarily what Samuel Adams was driving to when he became the father of the American Revolution. So come on back next week as we take a look at Sam Adams returning and those anti-federalists getting it right.